Here is what appears to be a very complicated list of all these mechanical things that we need to know for the examination. But the good news is, I'll bet you know all of this stuff already, and a lot of it, ladies and gentlemen, is nothing more than 7th grade biology. Let me prove it to you. A microbial contaminant is something that is microscopic and can contaminate. In other words, it can contaminate what? What are we here to talk about? Food. So you need a microscope to see it, and it can contaminate food? Yes, absolutely. It's called a microbial contaminant, which is perfectly synonymous with a microorganism. Those words mean the exact same thing. You could also call them bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi. Those words are perfectly synonymous. They mean the exact same thing. You could also call them biological contaminants. The word bio means life. All of these things are alive. And anything inside the human body is alive. Saliva, blood, or whatever else is inside the human body. Use your imagination as a biological contaminant. You could also call them pathogens. Pathogens are disease-causing microorganisms. All those words, ladies and gentlemen, mean the exact same thing, but I'm a real simple sort of a guy. Guess what real simple word I use to describe all those things? Simplest word you can think of. Germ. Germs is all they are. The conditions that affect the growth of germs in food is a very important acronym called FAT-TOM, from top to bottom. Food, acidity, temperature, time, oxygen, moisture. Those are the conditions that can affect bacterial growth, depending on to what extent those conditions exist. I'm going to explain it. It's simple stuff, and you'll understand it. The food that supports the growth of germs in food is a very important concept that you're already familiar with. It is called potentially hazardous food. It's the food we're here to talk about. I mean, we're here to talk about all food, but generally food that is non-potentially hazardous, like a cracker, there's only one thing that can go wrong with a cracker. What is it? Stale. Is stale food perfectly edible? Stale food is perfectly edible. There's only one thing that can go wrong with non-potentially hazardous food. What is it? Kind of. There's only one thing that can go wrong with non-potentially hazardous food. Yep. Yep. If you store it like this and then that happens, now that's a problem. So how do I fix this problem? Just store it like that, and then the problem is solved. Now, what can go wrong with this non-potentially hazardous food when it's properly stored? Nothing. It's edible in perpetuity because stale food is perfectly edible. Why does it have a date stamp on it? There's only one reason why manufacturers date stamp non-potentially hazardous food. What is it? Freshness is a function of quality, which has nothing to do with food safety. Now, that's going to be their argument, but in the world of food safety and sanitation, it just ain't true. There's only one reason why they date stamp it. What's that one reason? So they can sell more food. You'll see that it expired, you'll throw it away, and you'll run to the store and buy more. Because it's edible in perpetuity, even if it's stale, as long as it wasn't cross-contaminated upon. So, the food that supports the growth of germs in food is called potentially hazardous food. It's the food we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about all food, but if it's non-potentially hazardous and you store it properly, we're kind of done talking about it. We classify foodborne illnesses two ways. And by the way, anybody outside this room would call that food poisoning. There's really no such thing as food poisoning, but that's what they call it, so that's what we'll call it. There's only two ways to get food poisoning. You can become infected or you can become intoxicated. If you eat a germ, you're infected. You'll know it in a day or two. If you drink too much chemical, you're intoxicated. You'll know it instantaneously. Infected from a germ, you'll know it in a day or two. Intoxicated from drinking too much chemical, you'll know it instantaneously. Bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi. Let's start with the easy one. It's called fungi. It's called mold. What do you do with all moldy food? Period, end of story. Conversation's over. And the reason is because the food code says on page 3 that you are obligated to serve only wholesome and unadulterated food. Wholesome means pure, unadulterated means uncheated. If there's a little bit of mold on the corner of a big brick of cheese, it's cheated, you throw the entire food away. Because you are responsible as a permit holder who is under the guise of the regulatory authority and as a certified professional food manager to serve only wholesome and unadulterated food. Now let's assume for a minute that y'all want to come to a pool party I'm having on Saturday in my house across the bay in Brandon. Y'all show up at about noon, we'll be splashing in the pool, having a couple of cold beers, and one of y'all says, hey Dave, throw some burgers up on the grill. So I go inside the house, get some burgers, throw them up on the grill. Hey Dave, remember to cook those to 155. Thanks for the reminder. Hey Dave, throw some cheese on my burger. So I go inside the house, get a brick of cheese, and I come out, and there's a little bit of mold on the corner of the brick of cheese. What do I do with the food? Absolutely, I serve it. I don't throw it out. I pull out an unsanitized pocket knife out of my pocket. I cut off the moldy part. It falls on the weather deck. My dog runs over and eats it. I cut off another piece. I throw it on your burger. You're perfectly fine with that. Everybody eats their burgers. Everybody loves their cheeseburgers. And off we go. Because at home, there's no permit hanging on the wall. And the regulatory authority can't really knock on my door. Right? So that's the big difference between what you do at home and what you do inside a retail food service establishment that is under the guise of the regulatory authority who uses the food code as the basis for their inspection. Fungi, mold, throw it away. Bacteria, viruses, and parasites are killed inside of a retail food service establishment by washing, rinsing, and sanitizing smallwares, pots, and pans, or what we call the application of heat. The application of heat is a real fancy word for what? Cooking. So you want to deal with bacteria, viruses, and parasites? You wash, rinse, and sanitize them to death, or you cook them to death. If you're not ready to cook them to death, what do we do with the food? Store it cold, 41 or less, because if you store the food cold, that slows microbial growth. Is refrigerating food to slow microbial growth a good thing or a bad thing? Is refrigerating food in its raw state in order to slow microbial growth a good thing or a bad thing? It's a good thing. That's why we refrigerate food. Now the difference between bacteria, viruses, and parasites is that if you put a bacteria or a virus in the refrigerator or the freezer, all you do is slow its growth, and or maybe it hibernates or becomes dormant. It just doesn't grow as fast depending on the temperature. You cannot freeze bacteria and viruses to death. It's not humanly possible outside of a clinical laboratory, and we're not here to talk about clinical laboratories. Now, parasites can be frozen to death. If you put a parasite in the freezer for 7 days, it'll die. Bacteria and viruses only grow slower under refrigeration. And the best example of why you would refrigerate food in order to kill parasites so you could then properly thaw the food and then eat the dead animal raw is called sushi. Because remember, in the salt water, parasites live in the salt water, fish live in the salt water. The parasites become what we call systemic. When I drank my water, then my ice water was systemic. Same thing with parasites. They get into the fish's system. They are then systemic. How do you kill the parasites? In the tuna fish, you freeze it for 7 days, and then you thaw it out, and then you eat it raw. It's called sushi. Bacteria and viruses have to be washed, rinsed, and sanitized, cooked to death, or if you put the raw food in the refrigerator, that simply slows microbial growth. Fungi, mold, throw it away. Biological contaminants. A biological contaminant is anything that's alive, including germs or anything inside the human body. The word bio means life. A chemical contaminant is any chemical, take your pick, there are hundreds to choose from. And a physical contaminant is anything you can physically see with the bare naked eye. Some of the best examples are seed pits, chicken bones, staples, Band-Aids, jewelry. If I pick up a chair and throw it in the food, it's a physical contaminant. What is the single most common physical contaminant in any retail food service establishment? Hair. Yep, so that's why we wear a hair restraint.
Baseball cap?
Sure. So we want to prevent biological, chemical, and physical hazards from entering the food chain. Food allergies, there are 8 common allergens known to man. The 2 most common are peanuts and shellfish. Peanuts, shellfish, fish, wheat, soy, soybeans, tree nuts, eggs and milk. Some people lump that in as dairy. That's okay too. And you can get hives, you get all nauseous, your face swells up, you can pass out, you can go into anaphylactic shock. Anaphylactic shock is the real bad shock, and most people die from anaphylactic shock. So here's the lesson to take away with food allergies. First of all, if anybody ever asks about their allergen in your food, the only answer you should have is none whatsoever. Shut your mouth and don't say a word, because you'd rather have them get pissed off and go eat up the street than die in your restaurant. About the most helpful thing you can do for them is give them a menu and an ingredient list, and they can cross-reference the menu and the ingredient list to figure out what they can eat. But ladies and gentlemen, you are not their doctor. Please don't get in the habit of dispensing medical advice when you're not a doctor. So you give them a menu and an ingredient list, let them cross-reference the two, and if they have any more questions for anybody, they should step outside and call their doctor, because you're not their doctor.